right. Good afternoon and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series, our premier digital platform featuring a variety of programs to provide you timely, engaging, and essential education when and where you need it most. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at NCIA, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to another edition of our Service Solutions series being presented today by Cannabiz Media. If you're just joining us, please stay on the lookout for housekeeping instructions to be relayed via the chat window, so we're not taking up any more valuable time with routine info. And if you have any questions for our team on how to participate in this virtual event, please message myself or Brooke Gilbert at any time via a private message through the chat. Now, let's get this show on the road. In this edition of our Service Solutions series, we're joined by the team at Cannabis Media for an in-depth look at their recent research reports, the Cannabis Software Stack, and the point of sale software in the cannabis industry 2020. During this session, they'll provide a comprehensive analysis of the market shares of various point of sale software platforms used by cannabis dispensaries and retailers across the United States, while digging into the trends discovered since their 2018 report. Finally, our speakers will also share what they learned about CRM vendors in the space during the analysis of their report. I'd like to welcome Ed Keating and Amanda Guerrero from Cannabis Media to the virtual stage. How are you all doing this afternoon?
Great, Brian, thanks.
We're doing great. Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you all for joining us. Well, before we kick things off, why don't we tell the audience a little bit more about your background and expertise? First off, Ed Keating is the co-founder and chief data officer of Cannabis Media and oversees their data research and government relations efforts. He has spent his whole career working with and advising information companies in the compliance space, overseeing complex multi-jurisdictional product lines in the securities, corporate, UCC, safety, environmental, and human resource markets, while focusing on workflow products over the last 25 years. At Cannabis Media, Ed enjoys the challenge of working with regulators across the globe as he and his team gather corporate, financial, and license information to track the people, products, and businesses in the cannabis economy. Next up, we have Amanda Guerrero. Amanda Guerrero focuses on business development and sales operations for Cannabis Media as the Sales and Trade Association's Relations Director, where she also co-hosts the Canna Curio podcast alongside Ed. With 10 years of entrepreneurial experience, her flair for networking and relation management have helped her flourish in the cannabis industry, where she is certain she has found a lifelong career. Amanda is a product of the South Side of Chicago. It looks like Greg's joining you from Chicago as well, but now calls Denver her home. We're very excited to have both of you all join us this afternoon to present today's session entitled Service Solutions, which companies are leading in the retail software segment, being presented by Cannabis Media. We'll turn it over to you all to kick things off, Ed and Amanda. And Ed, feel free to start your screen share now, and you can take it away from here.
Perfect. Thanks for the introduction, Brian.
My pleasure. I'm going to end the icebreaker poll and share the results of that as well, so everybody can dive into that as we dive into the session.
Very cool.
Great. Well, we'd like to thank you, Brian, for helping us put this together, and also many thanks to NCIA for letting us share this report. It's the third year that we've done it. So what we'd like to do is give everybody a little bit of background on Cannabis Media, because not all of you know who we are and what we do. So we were founded back in 2015, and right now we've built a pretty big database of every cannabis and hemp license we can find in the US and across the globe. International licenses are a really interesting area, especially now we're starting to see more of them come into the database.
And like our report, we work with companies, both cannabis and hemp organizations across the US and the rest of the globe. We're working with industry, the segments within software, cultivation, manufacturing, retail, paraphernalia, and packaging, professional services, media, and industry organizations.
And in terms of how do we put this database together, it's really focused on how we started it 5 years ago. My co-founder and I both come from the information industry, essentially publishing, and We bring sort of all those markets that Brian referenced before of securities, corporate, uniform commercial code, all that kind of stuff. We brought it to bear into this highly regulated market because we felt that there were, great needs here to be able to be essentially the database of record. So we've done our best to gather that information and make it easy for people to use.
Yeah. This is the product. This is what we're working with, the licensed holder database.
Yeah, and just to give you an idea, this is the information that we compile. We start with state information, and then we work really hard to add other information, whether it be through our phone calling, where we can find out what kind of point of sale somebody has, or what the square footage they may have in terms of the size of their operation, number of employees. But we just work really hard to add information beyond what's generally available so that we can really assist people in meeting their business, competitive, and sales intelligence needs. So in terms of today, we're going to focus on a couple areas. We'll walk you through the methodology, sort of how did we actually come to do this report and why? Why did Cannabiz Media decide to go down this road? And we'll also touch on key findings in a handful of areas, or less than a handful, that we think are insightful and wanted to share with you in today's webinar.
As well as we'll cover what's next within the industry and what we're tracking here at Cannabiz Media, as well as answer all of your questions. So make sure to hit up the Q&A bot here, the chat section within the Zoom webinar.
So in terms of the methodology, it's really a research project. It's ongoing. We're trying to reach as many of the 7,000 dispensaries and retailers across the country as we can. There are some challenges that we've found in the last couple of years, but it's really all about phone calling. So as we reference here, it's a three-part process where we use phone calls, surveys, and we even get some license holders to share that information directly with us when they come and claim a license. But just in terms of the phone calling part, which is the most labor intensive, last year or this year, we did over 14,000 phone calls.
Wow.
But there are challenges to reaching the marketplace. And, what we found this year because of COVID is that it was harder to get through because everybody was calling these dispensaries and retailers because it's a market that everybody wants to reach. You probably can't do in-person phone call or in-person visits. So a lot going on with phone calls and emails trying to get into this tight market. So that was a bit of a challenge, but we did our best to get as much information as we could. We also worked to build on our software stack report and license data. So we really tried to wrap that in as well, because we think that there's a lot of intersections in and among the data so that we can give a holistic view of the industry.
Yeah. And for reference, the software stack report that Ed is talking about essentially breaks down all of the technology sectors within the cannabis space, where they interact within the seed to sale process, and we rank them based on the number of licenses that we have. We'll include a link for that within the Q&A section at the end of our presentation. Ed, I wanted to ask you, how many years have you done this report, and why do you create this report every year?
So this is our third year. We did it in 2018, 19, and now finally 2020. And it really came about from a customer request when we were starting to phone validate the data in our database. We wanted to make our data better, and we realized that we could actually engage in some survey questions, and a number of customers suggested that we look at getting the point of sale vendor, who has that software. And as we learned more about it, we found that that software is really at a critical nexus of the business. It's at the transaction. In addition, it has giant compliance implications, and it's something that other people may connect to, whether they be analytics firms that use it to figure out, what is being sold and why that's important and what's not being sold. In addition, there are, compliance issues too, because a lot of this information, most of it gets tracked back into Metric or Leaf Data Systems or BioTrack or others. And, that is stuff that, maybe the state may have access to. So it's just at such a critical nexus for any business, but especially these businesses, that we thought it was worthwhile to dig into and see what we could learn there.
Yeah. So why, so I guess you're going to answer the question of why point of sales vendors though, because they are at the, you know, at a very crucial point within the industry, in terms of the life cycle of these license holders, the retail and dispensary license holders. They are a critical part of the business.
Yeah, without a doubt, And you know, there are other parts of the software stack that we've looked at in the past, like accounting software, payroll software vendors, as well as seed to sale and CRM too. But you know, for now, the point of sale has really been where we found the most information and had the most to share. So let's kick into some of the information that we're able to find out this year. So one thing that we track, and this has been the most interesting, I would say, is how many vendors are in the space. And this comes out also as an offshoot of that software stack report, where we compiled a database there of over 300 vendors that were active in the space on the software side. But for point of sale, this year we identified 68 vendors, which ironically is the same as last year. However, the composition changed. So we found 13 new firms came onto the list, and 15 dropped off the list. So, you know, what's so significant about that? I mean, 13 out of 68 is actually a pretty big percentage. It's not something to be trifled with, but we think, you know, some of them, we may not have found them this year in our phone calling. So it doesn't mean that they're necessarily out of business. It's just, you know, they fell out of the scope of what we were researching. But, you know, it's interesting too that people are still coming into the space.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you know, licenses are increasing, but, you know, as we found in these last couple of years, it's an incredibly crowded area. And I think a hard one to really be a newcomer in.
Yeah. And we're definitely going to dive into what that competition looks like, you know, a little later into the webinar. But you have on this slide here, one state wonders. What is a one state wonder?
So one state wonder is a term we came up with when we started looking at the industry and who supported it and you know, who were the vendors. And especially on the point of sale side, when the states would roll out, say, you know, we're making cannabis available, we're going to do a seed to sale system. We look at the list of vendors, and in virtually every new state, there'd always be a handful of companies that only worked in that state. So hence the term one state wonder. They may have known people in the industry and said, geez, we're going to do this here. We think it's a great opportunity. They could have been, you know, folks who just did it in that state, maybe for some other industry, and said, geez, let's jump in and do it here as well. But almost without fail, every state has its one state wonder. And oftentimes when the vendors are published through metric in terms of who is connecting, they're often some of the first ones in there. And, you know, we're always intrigued, and, you know, we wonder what the long-term play is for them, because with 67 others besides that one state wonder in the marketplace, you know.
It's pretty competitive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So with the, I guess we're going to jump into the point of sale vendors here, but, you know, with those one state wonders, like how many of those 13 were actually like the new entrants to the market? How many of those 13 were one state wonders?
Yeah, actually a pretty good number. I think, you know, just looking ahead, we'll cover that in the next slide and show specifically, but it looks like probably, you know, maybe 10 were in that category where they came in and they were attracted to the state. But we wanted to share this view here that just juxtaposes how many licenses have we been tracking in the retail dispensary market in terms of basically number of stores, because the number of licenses can get a little tricky. In some states, you may run into an issue where a business has a medical license and a rec license, same store. So they're not going to have two different point of sale systems. And we learned that the first year when we had numbers that were a little larger than they should have been. So in 2019 and 20, we collapsed that, but you can still see that is one heck of a hill there between 2018 and 2020 in terms of stores, mostly driven, as we all know, by Oklahoma. having
Oklahoma. Oh, I can't wait to share that with you guys. I mean, Oklahoma has really, I mean, they are the pack leader. If you guys have been following along on our Canna Curio blog post, Ed actually does a retail and dispensary leaderboard report every year, and he updates it for a mid-year report to show the license growth. And, we'll get into that a little bit later, but Oklahoma is a state to continue to watch.
And the other line here is obviously how many vendors have we found, and it doesn't mean that those are all of them, but we, especially after doing the software stack report, we got a pretty good look at who could be out there. And as we said, it remained at 68, but the composition changed. So let's look ahead at who those new vendors were and answer Amanda's question about quote unquote the one state wonders. So here are the new entrants that we found, and it could just be that they came onto our radar. They might have been around in other states or we didn't get to them before, but you can see a lot of them, at least based on the data that we got, don't seem to have a lot of installations. And I will say that we found, as we talked about before, 14,000 phone calls to reach 7,000 stores. We didn't get to everybody, or they refused to answer. So some of you who may represent these companies would be like, we have way more than that. I'm sure you know. Sure you do. I know every year after we publish this report, I hear from everybody who's concerned about where they are. But in this case, some of these names are actually familiar. I've seen them in other states, but here we've got a couple with more than one license, and the obvious big one here is Weedmaps Retail.
Yeah, what's up with that? What's up with Weedmaps Retail in Oklahoma here?
I think it's a fascinating approach in that here's a company that I think all of us in the industry know, and we've known them as being a company that did a lot in terms of selling advertising, and really being a way to build awareness for these stores, maybe run their online list of products and whatnot. But perhaps in some ways, who better than to get into this space? Because, as I think of it from a strategy standpoint, they already have probably a pretty big share of wallet from these dispensaries and retailers.
Yeah.
And, they also, know these customers, and they've got a sales force that covers a lot of these markets. So, I think it's a very interesting move for them, and one that I would imagine they would probably take outside of Oklahoma. I mean, that's my view. Amanda, where you sit?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely assume that they're going to expand this out of Oklahoma. It seems like, with 5, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 5 new one state wonder light point of sale vendors existing within Oklahoma. I think that is going to continue to be a market to watch, not just from the license growth perspective, but also too, it could be a really great place to test out a point of sale software, because there are so many licenses to play with and to work with. It could be a really good launch market for some of these up and coming vendors like Weedmaps Retail.
Yep, I definitely agree. So we'll see how this plays out. It'll definitely be an interesting one to keep track of. And the other part with Oklahoma that I know a lot of people have asked us over the years, and I don't have an answer, which is, okay, there's thousands of stores or thousands of licenses in Oklahoma. How many of them are actually open? And that's a question that perhaps MMA knows, but we don't know that. But I've heard when we've done phone calling that sometimes the stores, just got their license. They don't really have anything else yet. So
yeah,
that'll be something.
Yeah, we've used about this on the Canna Curio podcast a few times. Especially when we first released that dispensary retail report, like when will we reach that point of saturation within the Oklahoma market? Right. And curious to see how the point of sales vendors play a role in that as well.
Yeah, and in terms of some of the stores too, in talking to people who've been on the ground there, some of them are rather small. They almost sound like the market that used to exist up in Maine, where there's a lot of caretakers who had enough patients that they kind of had a store, and they did have a store. So I wonder if there's
for a while.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's similarities there, and how will that grow in terms of how that marketplace is going to actually mature? Because with 4 million people and north of 2,000 dispensaries, that's a lot of stores per head count. And
Yeah.
it's people who aren't even older than 21. So yeah, we'll have to see how that plays out. So now jumping over to competition, we've talked a lot about this in the past in past reports, and it just continues to amaze me looking at it from a strategy standpoint. In my view, the leaders have continued to outpace the laggards. I mean, the big companies are still big, and yeah, there
Yeah.
was some share swap that we'll talk about, but 3 of them own 52% of the market. That's a lot. 6 own 70, 10 own 80. That means that 58 companies are probably trying to scrap for 20%.
How do you grow your, I mean, how do you grow your business when there's really realistically only 20% of the market to grab, and then you're not counting what you could obtain when you try and, steal a customer from a competitor, but like, how would you grow your business, Ed?
It's a great question, and one that we've tried to dig into of what are the competitive dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, sometimes you see people, and actually we saw this in a couple states where the price of their point of sale software was free. And what does that mean? Well, it was highly skinny down, and virtually anything that you wanted to do would cost money. It was almost like a gamification, like in-app purchases. So if you wanted to delete a record, well, that'll cost you something. But I thought it was still a clever way to kind of break through the clutter. Like, hey, man, it's free. There's
Yeah.
really no cost to you.
Why not? Yeah.
I think it is going to be challenging, though, for some of these companies to make a good, strong business. And I don't know if they're thinking of it as, well, somebody will buy me someday. But chances are that's only going to happen if you have a bunch of customers, or you've got some great software, great people, so that you've got a reason to acquire these other firms. So I think it is going to be pretty tough. In some ways, some of these large companies that we're looking at in the space are a little bit like an MSO in the cannabis world.
Yeah.
They operate across state lines. They have expertise. They have branding. They have people. Those are things that can easily move across borders. Obviously, they have to learn the rules in those states.
Mm-hmm.
They've already shown they're expert at doing that. I mean, and one of the things that you saw in the Software Stack report is one of the ways we evaluated people is how many states did they have a footprint in? Because that means two things. One, they figured out the rules and regulations in those states, because they need their customers to be compliant.
Yeah.
Two, they're probably making some of those choices based on how many licenses are available in that state. What is my potential addressable market? And
Yeah.
States like Oklahoma and California, pretty big addressable market. So long answer to your question, how do you compete there? I think there's a lot of challenges, though, to jumping into these states, especially now as we're getting down to a smaller list of states that haven't built a program. How are they actually going to, make it to the next level and really manage to compete? Because, look at how strong these big 4 companies are. These are all the ones I think that have at least 200 stores that we found. I mean, everybody has these nice, wouldn't we all like to have graphs like this for our sales meeting at the, look at us. I mean, yeah, there's been a couple dips. There's a dip here for BioTrack, but, look at where they were last year.
Yeah.
There's a lot. And this is, across the board. If we put trend lines here, they'd probably all be the same, which means that they all are growing, I think, in a pretty healthy way.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it makes me wonder what, next year's report is going to look like, especially to, from a license growth. I mean, we've got the election coming up, so a few markets to watch in terms of who's going to legalize. But ultimately, I think, when we dive in a little bit more into the individual states and the markets, some of the switching, I'll be curious to kind of see what those numbers actually look like.
Yeah, no, it is always a challenge to forecast, what we think will happen in the market. That is one of the last slides we have, sort of like, where do we think it's going to go and why? And COVID is certainly an X factor in that, because we don't know how that's going to impact things. But in a lot of states, sales of cannabis, rose pretty strongly, during this whole time. And, that's good for the industry, good for patients, good for customers. And it should be good for ancillary companies too, I think. But I don't know if it's going to be a rising tide lifts all ships. So let's move on to the leaderboards, which is always a thing that people kind of focus in on these reports. So here's the overall, what we found to be the top 10. And these are the number of stores essentially that we found that had these softwares in them. And we also provided the numbers going back 3 years. So this year, for the first time, Greenbits took the lead. BioTrack had it the last 2 years, and this year it's Greenbits. But other than that, certainly some growth among these companies, as we showed in that last bar chart. But most of the top 10 have been in the top 10, pretty much for most of the
time. Yeah. I'm curious with the top 4, that we have here. Can we break down how many of these are medical and adult use licenses?
Yeah, we've got that right here. So, looking at, this is the market share. So the last slide was how many units they had, but this is, our estimate of market share. And, always dangerous to extrapolate from our sample size onto the whole market, but in listening and seeing what some of the vendors talk about publicly about how many licenses they have across the United States, our numbers don't seem all that far off. So, I'm sure you've got marketing and sales teams and competitive intelligence people looking at this as well. But it gives you an idea that, here Greenbits is at 21%, BioTrack at 20%, FlowHub at 11%. And, definitely some movement up for Greenbits, for FlowHub, and for MJ Freeway. So certainly movement here, as we talked about earlier. And that's why some of your questions, Amanda, about, what happens as new states come online, who's going to get that share, I think is really going to be pretty interesting. But let's dig into what you're talking about, medical and adult leaderboards. So on the medical side, BioTrack has maintained their lead. This is the 3rd year they've been at the top. Their share is down. MJ's is up. Indica Online is also down. FlowHub is up. Cova up a little bit. So you can see here, there's been some movement around. Obviously, as the market continues to move forward, and I think as we get hopefully more data from Oklahoma, this might be a very interesting slide in the future. I just don't know which way it's going to go. And, a number of the states that are coming on board after November are probably going to be on the med side, but I don't know if they're giant license states, or will they be a more controlled, like in Missouri or Ohio, where, it's a well-defined set of licenses.
Understood. With the adult use markets, though, you've got Greenbits on top. Why do you think there is a difference between the medical and adult use markets? You kind of alluded to the license holders both having dispensary and retail licenses at one location. Why do you think there's such a difference here within the adult?
So we're looking at this just really quickly, because I think the next graph may help answer that question. Is, here we can see that Greenbits has definitely grown their share and in numbers. BioTrack pretty much stayed the same. I mean, that's sort of like going, sideways or staying in place. FlowHub definitely improved. And then the others, look to have dropped a bit. But I think if we look at this next slide, which shows medical and rec licenses, the medical the medical is the light green. And, you can see, how companies are choosing sort of where they're going to be. And I think part of it may be historical, how they got the start in the industry. So like in this case, this, green bar here is BioTrack. And we said that, they lead in the medical market. This is the rec market. And is that because they were an early starter in the industry when it was all medical? And, those customers have continued to renew. Could it be where they're located? Or finally, could it be a corporate strategy? Like, this is where we want to focus. I'm really not sure, what the driver is. We don't, have that level of insight. But, sort of from where you are, you're in a rec state. I'm in a med state. I think there's definitely different dynamics, at least from where I sit.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. In terms of the customers that you're working with or that you're attracting, the ways in which you market, as well as to the products that you're carrying. I mean, that really can dictate, the success of your dispensary.
Yeah, I agree. Now, we've talked a lot about competition, and one element for anybody who does competitive strategy or competitive studies is switching behavior. And this is the first year that we were able to look into it. We made some changes to our database so that we could show essentially previous point of sale software and current. So it helped us in a number of cases. I think we've got in all total maybe 120 switches that we found, give or take.
Yeah.
And the first observation is big brands were impacted the most. I guess that's kind of obvious because that's where most of the licenses are. I mean, as we've been showing in all these other slides, look at these big piles of licenses. There's a couple thousand of them just in a handful of firms. So that's not too much of a surprise, but the question is, what do we think may happen in the future? Do we think that this is going to continue? And that's a good question. Might we get more of those free software firms scraping off share or worse? And this is what you don't want, because I've been in these industries. People start to fight on price, and you build a race to the bottom. So
yeah.
I mean,
and we've seen that, from time to time here within the industry as well, especially when you're looking at, like the price of flower in certain markets, it has absolutely been, that race to the bottom. And it's interesting to see how that behavior is integrated within the point of sale systems as well.
Yeah. And also, as those prices have changed, sort of that, supply and demand, like in terms of how many licenses can be issued, people put in canopy caps. So it'll be challenging to see how this plays out. But with so many vendors out there, it's not hard for people to just try and compete on price, because any feature you have, I can build tomorrow maybe. So is there really anything that's that significant? So and that sort of gets to this point of how do these products change? And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I could see more things happening in terms of business alliances or product development. But in terms of the switching, here's what we did see. So the orange side are licenses that switched, sort of the number, and then on this side are the numbers that were gained. So obviously the biggest firms, as I said before, are at the top, which kind of makes sense because they have a lot more licenses. As a colleague of mine pointed out, when I was in one of these businesses and we were like the giant market leader, he said, "Ed, we've got share to lose. So what we're trying to do is maintain share, and people are just trying to take it away from us." And I think that's going to be true of really any of these large firms. But if you look down at Indica Online, they've done really well. They certainly added, they lost, and I think it's interesting that QuickBooks actually picked up close to a handful. So people are still using the QuickBooks, and we didn't have a slide on this, but if we ever did one on accounting software,
QuickBooks would win hands down.
So it's like 98% or something crazy like that. So I just hope someday to meet the product manager at Intuit to see if he or she can the market leader in accounting software in our space. So switching is something we'll definitely keep an eye on as time goes on, and we're continuing to ask those questions as we move forward in our ongoing surveys to find this out, because it is an indication of essentially competitive intensity.
Absolutely. Now, jumping into the key markets, I'm curious to see how these the switching, kind of behavior that we just, looked at, how that it plays a role within the key markets.
Yeah, where we saw switching, or I think where we reference it in the upcoming slides, is mostly in Oklahoma, which I thought was kind of interesting. At least, a quarter of the ones that we found were there. I mean, the most licenses are there, so you could say no surprise, but it's kind of a new market. And, I've never had to implement and install a point of sale software, but, how many of us willingly are going to change our online banking relationships? It's hard, it's a pain, nobody wants to do it. And I think the same is true with point of sale, it can get messy. You don't want to go out of compliance. I'm not saying that it's a set it and forget it thing, because it's an important piece of software. But so I think switching can be a big deal unless you just don't have a lot of transactions that you're trying to manage. So as we've talked about, California, Oklahoma, Michigan generate most of the new licenses. That's where most of the license growth has been. And as I update that report of licenses for dispensary retailers, which is more about every 45 days, they're always at the top of the list, 1, 2, and 3, or 2, 1, and 3 here. But what I found is that the leaders are not the big 4 firms in those states, really. So let's dig into that. So Oklahoma, as we said, they account, by our estimation, for 2,143 stores out of 7,000 across the country, give or take. 30%, 1 in 3 is in Oklahoma. And, as I said before, there's only 4 million people that live there. That's a lot of stores.
Yeah.
So highly competitive market, I would think. We counted 31 vendors there. So 31 out of 68 is a pretty high percentage, not quite half, but that's a lot of people trying to sell their product in the state. And it's up from last year. So 3 more, came into that space. That's, about a 10% increase from last year.
Yeah. And 5 of those are unique to Oklahoma.
That's right. Exactly. And there may be some of the other 31 that are unique too, which is a good research point for us to dig back into. Indica Online leads the pack again this year, as they did last year. So I think that's kind of interesting. Flow Hub comes in behind them, then Cova and BioTrack. So the big firms are surely represented there. But I think it's interesting that Indica Online is the leader again. So why? Hard to guess, but you can perhaps posit that they made a corporate decision to really go big in there and maybe provide great service, great product, et cetera. I mean, I don't know all the elements that people are using to assess which brand to go with, but they've been able to lead for 2 years in a row, which I think is a big deal. So
yeah, I agree. Sorry, go ahead, Ed.
I was gonna say, and then as we said before, there definitely has been switching here in Oklahoma. I mean, 26 is not a lot out of 2,143, but still, just to have any switching going on in a new market, I think is kind of significant. So
yeah. Now, did you and the team uncover any specific reasons for the switching within your research?
No, we didn't. It's hard enough to get through to these firms to find out what they're using, and if they switch, why. So it's a great research question to try and figure out. And as we look forward to 2021 and evaluate our research process, it would be good to gather that kind of information. Where we did spend some time and effort categorizing new data was we did find out customers that did not use software. They told us we do not use software. So my guess is in some of these states, they're using like metric kind of natively and they're working through spreadsheets and whatnot. And maybe some people prefer that, or they don't want to get the monthly, monthly software charges. I'm not sure what the driver is there, but I would imagine you start running into some compliance issues of, you can find out those that use software versus those that don't, who gets more visits from the inspector.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely, it seems like that would be a little complicated. And if you're trying to grow and scale and you acquire more business, that you would need to use technology. But an interesting point of data that we've uncovered within the research.
Yeah, indeed. So let's go over to the coast. So California, which has always been a big focus of this research for us, we found 26 vendors in the state, which is actually down a couple from last year, which is a little surprising. Indica Online and Trees were leading, Meadow, Greenbits, and Blaze followed behind them. So once again, Indica Online, the leader there. So
yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting that they're leader within Oklahoma and California. And then you think about the new entrants with the One State Wonders, right? With the Weed Maps Retail, Weed Maps Retail, Indica Online, Trees, all Los Angeles based, California point of sale vendors. Do you think that the reason why indica, specifically within California, indica and trees have that kind of hometown vendor advantage because they are local?
It very well could be. Maybe it could be one of those industry relationships. They know people, which can always help you out. And let's not forget the launch of the California rules and regulations was pretty harrowing, where we had all those temporary licenses, thousands and thousands of them. And then we had the infamous extinction event when they all came up for renewal, and these license holders had to scramble to try and get provisional licenses, annual licenses. So if you're a software provider, trying to keep track of moving rules and whatnot is pretty challenging, because you don't want to put your customers in harm's way. So maybe that local knowledge really did help them. And yeah, it's a great area for further study, I'd say. And maybe if we ever get to go back to trade shows in person, we can ask these folks, why they think this is happening. Or obviously, yeah, I was going to say, or people who are on the webinar right now, feel free to write in your comments or thoughts and help make us a little smarter on this one. But yeah. So in this case, we just didn't see, BioTrack, Greenbits, or FlowHub as leaders in the state. Now, I will say the caveat again, I'm sure they're in the state. I'm sure they have licenses in the state. Certainly, we probably just didn't uncover enough of them, but it was interesting to see who we did find.
Yeah. If you're a point of sale vendor here on the show with us today, make sure to tell your team, your retailers, to answer calls from Cannabiz Media so we can count them in our next report.
Great. Let's go back to the middle of the country. So Michigan is a state whose market has been described as potentially the second largest behind California. And there's a long history there. There were a lot of black market, gray market licenses there. Their licensure rollout was pretty tough in that they were shutting stores down, saying open. I mean, it was very difficult for entrepreneurs in that state. But a lot of that's in the rearview mirror. They have added a lot of new retail dispensary licenses this year, 210 by our count, or 20% of new ones added. So kind of a big deal, and that it's half of what Oklahoma added, but it's almost 3 times the number that came online in California. So it's definitely a growing market. Interesting thing here is Portal 42 is a vendor that we found had the most licenses, and they're Detroit based. So it sort of goes back to your point, Amanda, about a home state advantage perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps. That's so interesting about Michigan taking the 20% of the market growth, simply because of all the legislative challenges they've had over the years, within the state, just to get a, legal medical program, a legal adult use program that was conducive to a typical retail, kind of cultivation, kind of 360 business. I'm blanking on the industry term. It's been so long since I've been to trade shows. I'm forgetting the lingo here. But that's very interesting, especially too, because when you think about the retail and dispensary leaderboards that we published earlier this year, Michigan has consistently been number 2. 1 was Oklahoma, 2 is Michigan, and 3 is California, which is very, very interesting.
Yep, no, absolutely. So one of the things that we started noodling on as we were trying to understand the market, and really all the work we did in looking at the software stack, where we reviewed essentially 320 different providers, is we started to realize that there was a lot going on just among sort of this space of providers. And it speaks a lot as you look at a market to see what's going on in terms of what I call corporate development, and different names for it. But just looking at a couple of the large companies, there's a lot that has happened in the last year. So Greenbits raised a bunch of money, $23 million in Series B funding. That's a good size investment. And then perhaps coincidentally, and then more recently, Helix Technologies, BioTrack, announced a merger with a healthcare data provider. I think this was like last week, 10 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's big. So we've got capital raising, we've got mergers, we've got FlowHub also has announced, their infusion of cash.
Mm-hmm. That
Which,
magic number, 23 mil.
yeah,
Wow.
well, that must be something. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's good money if you can get it. So in addition, we see Akerna. We're just recently they launched a new solution that I think is really designed to help out in kind of this COVID environment. And
Yeah.
it sounds like it's almost like customer touching too, not just for the store, but making the transactions more seamless, safe, etc.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, once again, Akerna was just in the news for raising more money through
Wow.
IPO. There's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff happening in 12 months.
Oh yeah. Well, especially given, everything going on this year. I mean, we won't have to go into too many details, but it has been a, incredibly challenging year, but for the multiple industries, but I think within cannabis, because we are always so used to pivoting so quickly and, changing our priorities or adjusting to, kind of new legislative issues or challenges that have been brought up. It really has 2020 has really provided a great opportunity for businesses to raise money, expand their business, as well as opens up the door for a lot more acquisitions, like what we're going to see, what I'm hoping we're going to see over the next few years with the point of sale vendors here. Because I can't imagine that one state wonder vendors are going to be sustainable long term.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And these companies are raising money in private markets through private equity, or as occurring on the public markets, or a merger for BioTrack. They're a publicly traded company. People are making bets that they can continue to execute and win, and that they're going to have to do that by continuing to grow their share and perhaps grow their platform, et cetera. So I think it's positive that this is happening in our industry. I think it is perhaps textbook in that this is what companies do. The larger ones raise money. I would imagine some of these decks probably say, roll up, roll up, roll up.
Definitely.
Maybe not, I could be wrong, but we've seen this in other industries where this is exactly how things happen. And then at some point, there are not 68 vendors anymore.
Yeah.
5, 10, 4, I don't know. So, we'll have to see, but I think this kind of teases up to the next slide of what might
What's
be
next.
So, as we just talked about, I think that there's a great chance for continued corporate development. I think the large players are going to continue to get large, and if they execute well, they're going to continue to acquire customers. Some of them may even acquire other providers. I think it was a Akerna that picked up Trellis last year, if I remember correctly. So, that makes a lot of sense. And if you have the cash or the shares to give, it's a way to create a much larger footprint for your business.
Yeah. Looks like you also picked up Ample Organics, Ostap, Rapico just mentioned that in our chat.
Excellent. Thank you. So the other piece and part of what drove that software stack report was I was really intrigued by all the companies that connected to either Metric or Leaf Data Systems in Washington. So we built a database to conduct that research. And in looking at other press releases, Metric recently won the contract for Oklahoma.
That's right. Yeah.
9,000 more licenses are going to be coming through the Metric system. And I think they also won West Virginia. So that puts us at just under 90%. I think it's 89.4% of the active licenses, assuming those two were on board, would be managed through a Metric system to a state regulator.
Wow.
So, what does that mean for the market? I'm not sure. The way I sometimes think of Metric in a positive way is that in some ways they're kind of becoming a de facto utility. I mean,
yeah,
everybody's connecting to them. And if you are one of these multi-state point of sale vendors or seed to sale vendors or ERPs, you have multiple touch points with that system. maybe you're doing it from Colorado and California, soon to be Oklahoma. So that is an expertise, and it is something that positions you well. And as I said in the report this summer, if I were having to decide, if I were running one of these businesses as a license holder and had to choose a vendor, I think for me, perhaps based on all the markets I've worked in, I'd want somebody who's been not in just one state, but who can comply with regulations in multiple states. One, it helps me if I ever want to move beyond to another state. But two, it means this is not their first rodeo. And if a new rule comes in a state, maybe they already dealt with that in Colorado, and then they're like, oh, Ed, here's how we handle this. So it'll be curious, but I think having sort of this metric expertise, if you will, is going to have some impact on the industry, and we'll have to wait to see how this will play out.
Yeah. And obviously we will be tracking that here at Cannabiz Media and sharing that with you guys in our annual Software Stack report.
Indeed, we will. So wrapping up, the last 2 points is I expect more consolidation will occur. I'll say it here, and maybe I'll come back next year and be right or wrong, sort of like Chris Walsh at MJ BizCon. I think there will be less vendors than we see this year. I don't think 68 will be the number. I don't know how it'll change, but just given what's going on in COVID, how easy is it to convince somebody, let's say over the phone or through an online webinar, to switch their whole system over? Like, hey, man, I use this one, not this one. I think that's going to be really hard. And if you're an established vendor, I think it's an easier play for you. So that's one prognostication I'll make. And then lastly, sort of building on that last slide with all the data about big moves by the best license holders or the biggest license holders, I think product features and partnerships are going to happen. I could see people doing more work with CRM vendors. We've seen some of those announcements with companies like Dutchie, Springbig, et cetera. I could see more of that happening as these larger companies try and own essentially a greater share of the stack. Some of them, like BioTrack, I think, and J Freeway Akerna, they already have a whole suite of offerings. Point of sale is one part of what they do, but they also have seed to sale, and in some cases, almost like an ERP presence, which you probably can't sell that to every license holder. Those small mom and pop dispensaries in Oklahoma do not need that. But if you're an MSO,
you need that. That's what you want.
You need that. So, sort of a final note here is I think some of these larger companies that we highlighted are going to continue to operate in some ways like an MSO. They're going to be in multiple states. They're going to be working on bigger deals, and we'll be keeping an eye on that information as it comes through.
All right, Ed, my last question for you, and then we can kick it to the audience and see what questions they have here. What markets should we be paying attention to with the upcoming election and going into 2021?
Yeah, I think in terms of the states that we're most focused on, it's not necessarily all the election states, but interesting to see what's going on with Illinois in terms of licensure. Massachusetts is issuing a lot of licenses, and that's a big market. Maine as well. I think they are sort of upping their game. And in terms of states that we really think will be interesting, New Jersey, because of their proximity, the governor's behind it. So we think that's going to be a really big deal, and is going to have impacts. So those are the states that I've got my eye on. Any that you're keeping an eye on?
Arizona, absolutely, I think is going to be a market, to watch here coming up. Just from personal interest, I love that market. Always had a good time, but curious to kind of see how they expand their medical program.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome.
Wow, fantastic. I think we're going to transition over into the Q&A portion of the program. While we're going to dive into question and answer, please do note the contact information here for both Ed and Amanda. You can reach out with them and follow up with them if you have any more in-depth questions or any questions about their report or Cannabiz Media's products or services. And with that, why don't we transition into Q&A? We've got a few questions here logged from Carol, Ostep, and Jerome. Why don't we have, I know a few of these looks like they've already been addressed in some form, and we're coming through in some of those in-depth parts of the presentation. Amanda, do you see a question here in particular that stands out as one that we haven't touched on or might be able to piggyback on at the tail end of the presentation?
Let's see here. How many, I like this question from OSTOP. How many one state wonders are multi-vertical beyond point of sales? I think we kind of alluded to that with the MJ Freeway BioTrek dialogue, but, regarding, the 360 ERP solution, but Ed, any insights there that you want to share?
I think that some of the, like OnPause is very interesting if I'm thinking of them correctly, because they're in a couple states, and my guess is if I were them, if you think of the sort of typical strategic approach, they probably have like really good customer intimacy, really good customer support. They know what they're trying to do and they focus on one thing. I like to think Cannabis Media does that too. We focus on licenses. That's really what we do. We don't get into other areas of content. So I think that companies like that may do fine. The question is, what makes somebody an attractive acquisition target? Usually, I think it's going to be number of customers. And the question for any company is, do I want to buy you, Amanda, or can I steal your customers? Cheaper to steal them. And by steal, I mean by selling to them and giving them, a better offer. So, I think that can definitely happen. But, I think people are going to buy if they want to get share, because if you've got a lot of share in a state, I think that can make you attractive to one of these vendors who maybe hasn't done that.
Yeah. And to just address Carol Richards, the top 3 point of sale vendors in Washington state, you can check out the software stack report that we published earlier this year, where you can actually go through and see some of the point of sale vendors that we were tracking here. That's on the website, and you can sign up for that.
Yeah. And Carol, just to dive in, we probably got that data in terms of specifically for Washington. We didn't publish every state in terms of who are the leaders everywhere, but if you reach out to my contact information there, I'd be happy to dig into that and be able to get back to you who we found, at least in Washington, because that's an interesting market. There was another question here. Are these retailers, or do they include the total number of dispensaries within a retailer? That's Jerome Bryant's question. I think the question I want to answer here, at least if I understand it, is we've worked hard to go through the whole database and make sure that we're not double counting when somebody has 2 licenses. So if somebody has both licenses, that's obviously one store. And we see it as a situation where we count that point of sale once. So I don't know if that gets at the answer, but that has come up before as a possible answer to that one. So
awesome. Well, I think for us here, that'll wrap up the Cannabis Media Industry Essentials webinar. We love sharing this information with you guys. Again, if you want to get more information, you can reach out to myself or Ed Keating. We've got our contact information up here, and I think Brian's going to take it away. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, why don't we give a big virtual round of applause to Ed and Amanda. If you enjoyed today's session, why don't you, thank you, Brenda. Raise your hand in the audience poll. Cue up my sweet little sound effect here. I haven't gotten tired of these yet. Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you all so much, Ed and Amanda. We really can't show our appreciation enough for you all diving into such a nuanced topic and doing so in such an engaging and thoughtful way. I'm really excited to dive into some of the past episodes of Canna Curio now. You all have a great rapport with each other, and I can really tell that you all really enjoy having conversations together. So thank you all for presenting that fantastic session. As always, we're going to leave today's session by highlighting all of the fantastic member companies that participated in today's session and giving a little more exposure to our sponsors of today's session, Cannabiz Media. So stick around for the next few moments. Don't go anywhere. We'd love all of your all's engagement inside the chat room while we display this member appreciation credit sequence. And please do note that all of you all will be directed to complete an attendee survey following the meeting room closing. please do complete that as soon as possible. It will grant you immediate access to our presentation file that we'll send along via email in a .pdf format. And then also stay on the lookout for a link in that follow-up email to a public listing of a formatted recording for today's session that's going to be posted on NCIA's website inside of our Industry Essentials webinar archive, which you can find at www.thecannabisindustry.org at any time. And we hopefully should have today's session up by the end of the week. All right, perfect. So we'll leave you with this end of event credit sequence highlighting all of the 50 plus businesses that participated in today's session, along with our board of directors and policy council members, alongside some audio stylings by our resident musician at our Colorado-based events, KJ Liss, and his Illinois-based musical project, Indigo Sun. If you enjoy the next 2 minutes, definitely do make sure to log into NCIA Connect as well, as we're showcasing all of our Cannabis Caucus cyber recordings that were made over the last month. And Kyle is a prominent musician during the happy half hour segments of each of those recordings. So as Amanda is noting there, huge thank you to Cannabiz Media once again. Please make sure to follow the links to download their point of sale software report, as well as the other resources that they have linked there. Follow their Canna Curio podcast, and make sure to stay on the lookout for our follow-up email. Thank you all for joining us again, and we hope you all have a great day. With that, enjoy our end of event credit sequence.